Hello guys, Ition Clay 999. Today's video is about Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, a name forever etched in both admiration and controversy, was born in 1451 in the seafaring Republic of Genoa, now part of modern-day Italy. He was not born into wealth or nobility, but from a young age, he was enchanted by the sea. Sailing was more than a skill, it became his destiny. The world at the time was changing. The Ottoman Empire had seized control of major land trade routes, choking Europe's access to spices, silk, and gold from the east. With increasing demand and dwindling supply, European nations looked to the ocean for new paths, new lands, and new wealth. Columbus believed the earth was round, as many educated men of the time did, and theorized that one could reach the east by sailing west across the Atlantic. Though his logic underestimated the size of the earth and ignored the vast landmass between Europe and Asia, his ambition remained unshaken. For years, he sought sponsorship for his daring voyage. He faced rejection after rejection from monarchs across Europe. Many saw him as a dreamer, a fool, a man chasing myths on endless waves. But his persistence finally found a home in Spain, where Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, after the conclusion of the Reconquista, agreed to fund his voyage. In 1492, with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Columbus set sail into the unknown. These wooden vessels, manned by sailors who feared monsters and falling off the edge of the earth, crossed into uncharted waters. After weeks at sea, with morale faltering and mutiny brewing, land was spotted on October 12, 1492. Columbus had not reached Asia, as he believed, but had stumbled upon the islands of the Caribbean, the gateway to the New World. He called the native people Indians, believing he had reached the Indies and claimed the land for Spain. What followed was a complex and often tragic chapter of history. Columbus made 4 voyages across the Atlantic, discovering parts of the Bahamas, Cuba Hispaniola, and even touching the shores of Central and South America. His explorations opened the door for the age of European colonization, forever changing the course of human history. But Columbus's legacy is a heavy one, not only marked by discovery but also by destruction. The encounters between Europeans and the indigenous peoples led to enslavement, the spread of disease, and the decimation of native populations. Columbus was eventually arrested and returned to Spain in chains for his brutal misgovernance in the New World. Though he was later pardoned, he died in 1506, unaware that he had discovered continents unknown to the Old World and believing he had simply reached the edges of Asia. His voyages were celebrated for centuries, enshrined in textbooks and holidays, portrayed as the bold opening chapter of the modern Western world. Yet today, his name invokes debate and reflection. To some, he is a hero who dared to go where others feared, who unlocked a new world and connected distant peoples. To others, he is a symbol of colonial oppression, whose arrival began centuries of suffering for indigenous populations. Understanding Columbus requires embracing both the triumph and the tragedy. His story is not just one of maps and ships, but of human ambition, miscalculation, courage, conquest, and the unstoppable ripple of change. In studying him, we are reminded that history is rarely black and white. It is woven with glory and grief, pride and pain. Columbus did not set out to be a villain, nor perhaps a hero. He was a man driven by faith in his own vision, a sailor who stared into the endless blue and believed he could find another shore. And in that belief, flawed though it may have been, he launched a chain of events that would shape the world in ways he could never have imagined. Though the voyage of 1492 remains the most iconic, Christopher Columbus undertook 4 separate journeys across the Atlantic, each marked by ambition, hardship, and controversy. After his first triumphant return to Spain, Columbus was celebrated as a hero. The Spanish monarchy showered him with titles, promises of wealth, and governance over the new territories. However, with privilege came pressure, and Columbus's second voyage in 1493 was much larger, involving 17 ships and over 1,200 men. This journey was not about exploration alone, it was about colonization. He returned to find the settlement at La Navidad destroyed, with his men killed, likely due to abuses toward the indigenous Taino people. Still, Columbus pressed forward, founding a new settlement called Isabela on Hispaniola. But trouble brewed quickly. Harsh conditions, starvation, and conflict with the native population created chaos. Columbus, struggling to manage the growing unrest, resorted to brutal measures. He enslaved many of the Taino, sending hundreds back to Spain, many of whom died en route. Those who remained were forced into labor, subjected to a system that laid the groundwork for the encomienda Spanish labor system that exploited native populations. His authority began to falter, and complaints from settlers and officials grew louder. The third voyage in 1498 took Columbus farther south, to Trinidad and the northern coast of South America, where he finally recognized that he may not have reached the outskirts of Asia. His belief was shaken, but he remained convinced that great riches lay ahead. However, upon returning to Hispaniola, Columbus found the colony on the verge of collapse. His inability to govern, combined with accusations of tyranny and cruelty, led to his arrest in 1500. Shackled and humiliated, he was sent back to Spain no longer as a hero, but as a disgraced figure. Yet, his story did not end there. The monarchs eventually released him, and in 1502, Columbus embarked on his final voyage, seeking a passage to the Indian Ocean through Central America. He explored the coasts of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, but never found the strait he sought. Shipwrecked and marooned in Jamaica for over a year, Columbus was eventually rescued and returned to Spain for the final time. He died in 1506, aged 55, largely forgotten by the court and unaware that he had played a role in the discovery of a new continent that would reshape the world. He believed until the end that he had reached Asia. While Columbus may have died unaware of the full significance of his voyages, history would soon recognize that 1492 marked the beginning of a radical transformation of the world, a period now known as the Age of Exploration or the Age of Discovery. Columbus's journeys initiated an era of European expansion across the Atlantic, leading to the colonization of the Americas, the exchange of goods and ideas, and, tragically, the mass suffering of indigenous peoples. The Columbian Exchange, a term coined by historian Alfred W. refers to the massive transfer of plants, animals, cultures, diseases, and populations between the eastern and western hemispheres following Columbus's voyage. This exchange introduced Europeans to crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes, foods that would eventually revolutionize European agriculture and cuisine. Meanwhile, Europeans brought wheat, rice, sugarcane, horses, and cattle to the Americas, forever altering native ecosystems and ways of life. However, this era also ushered in darker legacies: the introduction of smallpox, measles, and influenza to the New World decimated indigenous populations, with some estimates claiming up to 90% of native people perished within a century. These pandemics were catastrophic, wiping out entire communities, elders, traditions, and knowledge systems that had been passed down for generations. Additionally, the appetite for labor to support European colonial economies gave rise to the transatlantic slave trade, where millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands and subjected to centuries of brutal enslavement. Columbus's legacy, therefore, cannot be viewed through a singular lens of discovery or heroism. He opened the door to new global networks and cultural fusion, but also to exploitation, genocide, and imperialism. The cities he founded, the maps he altered, and the myths he inspired had lasting repercussions. For European monarchs and merchants, Columbus became a symbol of daring ambition and profitable conquest. For indigenous communities, his name often evokes memories of violent upheaval, forced conversions, land dispossession, and centuries of colonial domination. These contrasting narratives have made Columbus one of the most polarizing figures in history. Statues erected in his honor have been the subjects of protests and removals in the 21st century, as societies reevaluate what it means to celebrate a man whose voyages marked both the dawn of globalization and the beginning of immense human suffering. As centuries passed, the legacy of Christopher Columbus took on a life of its own, transformed, reinterpreted, and politicized by different cultures and ideologies. In the 18th and 19th centuries, during the rise of nationalism and European Empyrean pride, Columbus was elevated as a symbol of courage, vision, and divine destiny. His image appeared in paintings, literature, textbooks, and monuments, often cleansed of complexity and repainted in heroic colors. In the United States, he was embraced as a founding Methodic explorer who symbolized progress, Christian values, and the bold pursuit of the unknown. In 1792, on the 300th anniversary of his voyage, celebrations were held across the U.S., particularly among Italian Americans, who saw Columbus as a national hero who reflected their immigrant roots and contributions to American society. That identity solidified further in 1937, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared Columbus Day a national holiday, influenced by lobbying efforts from the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization. This symbolic gesture gave Columbus a prominent and officially sanctioned place in American history. However, the mythology of Columbus was often disconnected from the historical record. While he was portrayed as a benevolent pioneer in many schoolbooks and patriotic narratives, growing historical evidence painted a far grimmer picture of his actions, especially his role in the violent subjugation of the Taino people, the institution of forced labor, and the setting of precedents for colonial brutality. As post-colonial thought gained traction in the 20th and 21st centuries, historians, activists, and indigenous groups began to push back against the sanitized version of Columbus's story. Movements arose to reframe Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day, aiming to honor the resilience, cultures, and histories of Native communities, rather than celebrate the onset of colonization. Universities, cities, and even entire states began to replace Columbus Day with more inclusive alternatives. The statues that once symbolized honor became sites of protest, graffiti, and removal. In places like Minneapolis, Seattle, and Washington, D.C., the day was redefined to reflect a broader and more honest historical reckoning. This evolution in public consciousness reflects not just a reevaluation of Columbus, but a larger societal shift toward grappling with uncomfortable truths about imperialism, racism, and historical memory. Columbus has thus become more than a man. He is a mirror reflecting the values of the societies that remember or reject him.